Comanche men were known as fierce fighters, but many accounts point to the women as the ones people truly feared. They held power in ways outsiders never expected, and their influence reached far beyond the battlefield. What exactly gave Comanche women such a reputation? It starts at home. While men rode off hunting buffalo and raiding enemies, Comanche women controlled everything that actually mattered back at camp. They owned the horses, managed the trade goods, and decided who got what, when, and how much. Think your mom controlling the family credit card is powerful? Comanche women literally ran the household economy. Now, the horses alone made them incredibly wealthy by Plains Indian standards. These weren't just pets or transportation. Horses were currency, status symbols, and survival tools all rolled into one. Comanche women didn't just own these valuable animals, they decided which ones to trade, which ones to keep, and which ones their husbands could take on raids. However, the real power came from controlling daily necessities. Food distribution was entirely in their hands. When hunting parties returned with fresh meat, women decided how much each family got. No woman's approval, no dinner. It's that simple. Meanwhile, the same went for clothing and shelter. Comanche women crafted every piece of leather clothing, every blanket, every teepee cover. Imagine if one person in your house controlled the thermostat, the refrigerator, and your entire wardrobe. That's the kind of power we're talking about. Beyond that, trade relationships with other tribes and even white settlers went through women too. They negotiated prices for goods and managed the complex networks that kept their people supplied with metal tools, weapons, and luxury items. These weren't casual transactions either. Women built multi-generational business relationships that could make or break entire communities. Furthermore, marriage arrangements were another source of tremendous influence. Comanche women often made the final decision on who their daughters married. This meant controlling political alliances between families and even different bands of Comanche. A well-placed marriage could secure peace treaties or create powerful military partnerships. Then, there's the fact that women controlled the band's wealth storage systems. They decided where valuable items were hidden during moves, how much emergency food to cache in different locations, and which goods to prioritize during hasty retreats. This logistical control meant that even if men made military decisions, women determined whether those decisions could actually be carried out. The weirdest part? Men actually depended on women's approval for almost everything they wanted to do. Planning a raid? Better make sure the women agreed it was worth the risk. Even war chiefs needed female support to maintain their authority. Without economic backing from women, male leaders quickly found themselves powerless and isolated. But their economic power was just the foundation for something much more dangerous. While they managed households and raised children, these women never forgot they lived in one of the most violent regions of North America. Enemy tribes, Mexican soldiers, and American settlers all posed constant threats. So Comanche women did what any sensible person would do. They learned to fight back with deadly efficiency. Their weapon of choice was often the bow and arrow. Not the small hunting bows you might expect, but full-sized war bows that could punch an arrow through a buffalo at 50 yards. They could thread an arrow through an enemy's ribs faster than most people today can swipe right on their phones. Besides bows, knives were always within reach too, not just for cutting food or working leather, but for close-quarters combat when things got really ugly. Comanche women carried these blades everywhere and knew exactly where to put them for maximum effect. They practiced specific knife-fighting techniques that focused on quick, silent kills. Later, when firearms became available through trade, women learned those too. Small pistols and rifles that could be concealed or quickly grabbed during attacks. They became surprisingly accurate shots, often outperforming men who spent more time showing off than actually practicing. Women approached firearms training with the same methodical precision they brought to everything else. But here's where it gets really interesting. Women weren't just defending themselves. They actively participated in camp defense strategies. When enemies attacked, women didn't run and hide. They fought hard. They knew the camp layout better than anyone and used that knowledge to create killing zones and ambush points. During battles, women also served as battlefield medics while fighting. They could patch up wounded warriors, drag injured people to safety, and continue fighting all at the same time. This multitasking ability made them incredibly valuable during extended conflicts where every person counted. The truly scary part, they joined offensive raids too. Not always, but when the target was especially valuable or personal revenge was involved, Comanche women rode alongside the men. They weren't just along for moral support either. Women often handled the psychological warfare aspects of raids, using intimidation tactics that were sometimes more effective than physical violence. What made them particularly dangerous was unpredictability. Enemies expected to fight male warriors. They didn't expect the quiet woman tending a cooking fire to suddenly produce a knife and know exactly how to use it. This constant state of readiness meant that Comanche camps never had truly defenseless moments. Even more unsettling was their ability to switch between domestic and combat roles instantly. A Comanche woman could be peacefully sewing one moment and become a lethal opponent the next. There was no switching into combat mode. They were always ready. This psychological pressure wore down enemies and made everyone think twice about threatening Comanche territory. Yet their combat skills were only part of a larger pattern of control. Politics among the Comanche worked differently than you might expect. There were no kings or presidents, but there were definitely power brokers, and most of them were women. Men might have been the official war chiefs and band leaders, but women controlled the resources those leaders needed to stay in power. Want to launch a major raid? You needed horses, weapons, and food supplies. Guess who controlled all of that? Naturally, this created an interesting dynamic where male leaders had to constantly maintain good relationships with influential women or risk losing their authority. Think of it like having to ask your boss for permission, except your boss is also your wife, your mother-in-law, and the person who controls your lunch money. Women used this economic leverage to shape major decisions about war and peace. They could effectively veto military actions by withholding supplies or support. If the women thought a particular raid was too risky or unnecessary, it simply didn't happen. This gave them de facto control over the tribe's military strategy. Additionally, the control over captives added another layer of political influence. When raids brought back prisoners, women decided their fate. Some captives were adopted into the tribe, others were sold or traded, and some faced darker endings. These decisions affected relationships with other tribes and even influenced future conflicts. Horse herds represented massive political capital, and women managed these assets carefully. Lending horses for raids or trading expeditions created debts and obligations that women could call in later. They essentially ran a complex banking system based on livestock and favors. Of course, alliance negotiations with other tribes often involved women as key participants, not just silent observers. After all, when diplomatic deals went bad, women were the ones who had to figure out how to keep everyone fed and supplied during the resulting conflicts. What's more, the enforcement of tribal rules and customs fell heavily to women too. They maintained social order through economic pressure and social influence that was often more effective than formal punishment. Women also controlled access to spiritual ceremonies and religious objects, adding another layer to their authority. The information networks that women maintained were incredibly sophisticated. They knew everything that happened within the band and often had intelligence about other tribes, enemy movements, and trading opportunities long before men heard about them. This information advantage gave them huge political leverage. Women also controlled the storytelling and oral history traditions that shaped tribal identity and values. They decided which stories got told, how they were interpreted, and what lessons were emphasized. This cultural influence helped them shape the next generation's attitudes and beliefs. The weirdest part about all this political influence? It was mostly invisible to outsiders. White settlers and government officials usually only dealt with male chiefs and assumed they held all the power. They had no idea that many of their negotiations were really with women operating behind the scenes. But this political savvy became truly frightening when directed against enemies. The first white captive to encounter Comanche women probably thought he was getting a break from dealing with fierce male warriors. He was very, very wrong. European settlers, Mexican traders, and American soldiers quickly learned that Comanche women were often more dangerous than the men they'd been fighting, not because they were physically stronger, but because they were unpredictable, strategic, and absolutely ruthless when crossed. Captivity narratives from the era paint a consistent picture. Male warriors might capture prisoners, but women controlled what happened next. Imagine being taken prisoner and finding out your fate rests with someone who looks like a grandmother but has the decision-making style of a mob boss. The psychological warfare was intense. Women would appear friendly and helpful one moment, then become cold and threatening the next. This kept captives constantly off balance and uncertain about their status or safety. They used this emotional manipulation to break down prisoner resistance and prevent escape attempts. Many captives reported that women were stricter guards than men. Warriors might get distracted by hunts, raids, or other activities, but women kept constant watch over prisoners while going about their daily tasks. They noticed everything. Women also developed sophisticated interrogation techniques that could extract information without obvious torture. Moreover, the speed of their justice was legendary. Cross a line, break a rule, or show disrespect, and consequences follow immediately. There were no appeals, no second chances, no lengthy deliberations. This swift enforcement created an atmosphere of fear that kept even the most rebellious captives in line. White traders learned to be extremely careful in their dealings with Comanche women. These weren't the passive trading partners they encountered in other tribes. Try to shortchange a Comanche woman in a trade deal, and you'd find yourself banned from doing business with the entire band. Women also maintained detailed mental records of every transaction and could recall specific details years later. Similarly, military commanders found them equally challenging. During negotiations or treaty talks, women often appeared as silent observers, but experienced officers learned to watch their reactions carefully. A subtle headshake or disapproving expression from influential women could kill a deal faster than any dramatic speech by male chiefs. The element of surprise was their greatest weapon against outsiders. Enemies expected fierce resistance from male warriors, but they consistently underestimated women. This led to devastating ambushes and defeats where unsuspecting forces found themselves under attack from directions they never considered threatening. Their reputation for torture and execution was particularly terrifying to enemies. Women developed methods of punishment that were designed to serve as warnings to other potential threats. These weren't random acts of cruelty, but calculated displays of power meant to discourage future attacks. Government officials found them particularly frustrating because they operated outside familiar power structures. You couldn't just negotiate with a chief and assume you had a binding agreement. Women held veto power over many decisions, but they weren't necessarily available for formal negotiations. This created diplomatic nightmares that confused officials for decades. However, this fearsome reputation was built on more than just attitude and tactics. Every Comanche woman carried around what amounted to a walking encyclopedia of survival knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death on the Great Plains. Their understanding of plants was particularly impressive and terrifying. They knew which roots could cure a fever and which berries would kill you in minutes. They could brew tea that would save your life or slip something into your food that would end it, and you'd never know the difference until it was too late. The medicinal knowledge extended far beyond simple remedies. Women understood complex treatments for serious injuries, infections, and diseases. They performed surgeries using stone tools that would make modern doctors nervous, but their success rates were surprisingly high. They also knew how to create anesthetics from natural sources and develop pain management techniques that were remarkably effective. However, the same knowledge that could heal could also harm. Plants that were medicine in small doses became deadly poisons in larger amounts. Women who understood these relationships could eliminate enemies without anyone suspecting murder. They could also create substances that caused temporary paralysis, hallucinations, or other debilitating effects. Their horsemanship often surpassed that of the men, which was saying something since Comanche males were considered the finest horsemen on the continent. Women could shoot arrows accurately while riding at full gallop and guide their mounts with subtle leg pressure while their hands were busy with other tasks. They also trained horses for specific purposes, creating specialized mounts for different types of raids or activities. Additionally, terrain knowledge was another crucial skill that women mastered completely. They knew the location of every water source, every patch of edible plants, every hiding place and escape route across thousands of square miles of territory. This knowledge included understanding seasonal changes, animal migration patterns, and weather indicators that could predict dangerous conditions. During harsh winters or droughts, this geographic knowledge literally kept people alive. While other tribes might starve during difficult seasons, Comanche women knew where to find food and water when obvious sources dried up. They maintained mental maps that included backup locations for every essential resource. The food management skills were particularly impressive during extended campaigns or long winters. Women calculated exactly how much dried meat, gathered plants, and stored supplies would be needed to keep the band fed for months. They also developed preservation techniques that could keep food edible for extended periods without refrigeration. Their crafting expertise went far beyond making pretty decorations. The weapons, tools, and equipment they produced were often superior to factory-made goods available through trade. Women could repair almost anything using available materials and often improved on original designs. Tool-making skills included creating specialized implements for different tasks. Women made different types of knives for various purposes, crafted specific arrows for different types of hunting or warfare, and produced tools that could serve multiple functions to reduce weight during travel. Weather prediction was another specialized skill that gave women tremendous influence over important decisions. They read signs in animal behavior, plant growth, and atmospheric conditions that let them predict storms, droughts, and seasonal changes with remarkable accuracy. This forecasting ability was crucial for planning raids, migrations, and resource-gathering activities. But these individual talents became truly dangerous when coordinated through organized leadership. The deadliest Comanche raids weren't just chaotic attacks by screaming warriors. They were carefully orchestrated military operations where women often served as the unseen commanders pulling the strings. While men provided the visible muscle and fighting power, women frequently handled the complex logistics that made successful raids possible. They planned supply requirements, coordinated timing with multiple groups, and managed the intelligence networks that identified valuable targets. Women also handled diplomatic relations with allied tribes and arranged safe passage through neutral territories. Small group coordination was where women's leadership skills really shone. Think of them as the special operations commanders of their time, except they were also running households and raising children while planning complex military operations. The positioning and movement strategies they developed were brilliant. Women understood that successful raids required more than just charging in and hoping for the best. They studied target locations, planned multiple approach routes, and prepared contingency plans for when things went wrong. They also coordinated feints and diversions that confused enemies about the real objectives. Timing control was perhaps their greatest tactical contribution. Women decided when raids should begin based on moon phases, weather conditions, enemy activity patterns, and seasonal factors that affected travel and combat effectiveness. They also planned the sequencing of multiple simultaneous attacks to maximize confusion and prevent coordinated enemy responses. Furthermore, the communication systems they managed were remarkably sophisticated for a pre-electronic society. Using combinations of smoke signals, messenger networks, and coded messages, women could coordinate activities across hundreds of miles. They developed backup communication methods and established protocols for maintaining contact during extended operations. Post-raid management was entirely in women's hands, and this phase was often more complex than the actual fighting. They had to quickly evaluate captured goods, decide the fate of prisoners, distribute loot fairly among participants, and manage the integration of new resources into the band's existing supplies. Women also handled the diplomatic aftermath, managing relationships with affected tribes and planning responses to potential retaliation. The prisoner management aspect was particularly crucial and often brutal. Women made rapid decisions about which captives might be useful as slaves, which ones could be sold or traded, which ones might be adopted into the tribe, and which ones posed too much risk to keep alive. They also managed the integration process for adopted captives and monitored them for signs of potential escape or rebellion. High-pressure situations revealed their true leadership capabilities. When raids went wrong, plans fell apart, or unexpected complications arose, women often stepped in to make the critical decisions that saved lives and salvaged operations. They maintained clear heads during chaos and could rapidly adapt strategies to changing circumstances. The training programs that women developed for young warriors were comprehensive and effective. They taught not just fighting techniques, but also stealth, tracking, survival skills, and psychological warfare tactics. Women also evaluated the performance of raid participants and made recommendations about future assignments. The weirdest part about their military leadership was how invisible it remained to most outsiders. Enemy forces and government officials typically assumed they were fighting a traditional male-dominated warrior society. They never realized that many of their defeats came at the hands of campaigns planned and coordinated by women who never appeared on any battlefield. This combination of economic control, combat skills, political influence, fearsome reputation, specialized knowledge, and strategic leadership created something unprecedented. A society where women wielded power that was both invisible to outsiders and absolutely essential to their people's survival and success.